Carrie Michaels. I just spoke with some of you in our round robin event that we just had, and I'm moderating this session today. This is a presentation of the Nationwide Agricultural Experiment Station Coordinating Group called Health, Wellbeing, and Economic Opportunity for LGBT People in Rural Environments. This is also an extension of the year's work that we've been doing in the Children, Youth, and Family Consortium with Dr. Jennifer McGuire, our scholar in residence, on meeting the needs of transgender youth. So we have spent this past year traveling around the state doing presentations in communities outside of the cities and one in Minneapolis on transgender youth, talking about the research and mental health needs and nutritional needs. And from that, we got a lot of feedback that there's a lot more interest and demand in this topic area. In rural areas for all LGBT youth, and also some of those requests were coming from Extension. So I'm really glad that this group was here. We're really fortunate to have them. The purpose of this committee that you have in front of you is to first create an infrastructure for research and outreach projects across states, and they will talk more about that, and then to create and support a pipeline for people doing this work with LGBT people in rural areas. So this group has spent 2 years developing a plan for their work together, and they're now in their first year of a 5-year approved plan through the Agricultural Experiment Station. And each year they go, as I understand it, to a different location, a different state, and now they're here. And so we're lucky to have them. Thank you all. The way that we're going to do the rest of our time here is I'm going to ask each person to come up here and introduce themselves, talk a little bit about their research expertise, and then what they bring to this collaborative project. So they each have a few slides, and then we have time at the end, plenty of time for question and answer.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. My name is Erika Graf. I'm an assistant professor at Virginia Tech in the Department of Human Development and Family Science, and I'm also a family therapist and work with the doctoral program in marriage and family therapy there. So my research is primarily on disclosure experiences and disclosure decision-making for LGBTQ youth. So looking at sexual minority disclosure, sexual orientation disclosure. I also do work on affirmative therapy practices for sexual and gender minorities, and I have also worked with Extension in Virginia on some research and some training like Courtney is putting together for Extension professionals across the state of Virginia on sexual and gender minority issues. So what I'm going to present here are some very specific findings from some of my work on disclosure decision-making for families and how to help rural families in particular get through this process. So this first figure shows that four interlocking factors tend to be the factors that youth consider when they're making their decision to disclose. And this is from my research in particular, but it maps on well to the other research in this area. And so the sexual identity development and integration process is what we might typically see as the coming out process. And so in my work, we've seen that for some youth, where they're at in their own coming out process affects their decision whether or not they choose to disclose to their family or even particular family members. So for example, one youth in my project said, "Mom asked if I was gay like over and over and over." And I was like, no, why would you think that? And then ended up coming out in his own time when he was ready. And so even though he had these messages that mom was supportive, his own process was playing a role here. Family dynamics make sense, I think, for all of us in the room, as well as the idea of messages. So these are messages that you get from people in your family. They are sort of family level messages as well, like my whole family is super religious and I know they're very anti-gay. Or my dad watches Fox News all the time. Like these are messages that youth may interpret and think that, my family is or is not going to be accepting. And these messages also come from the community. If there's a really big anti-gay or anti-LGBTQ community focus, that these messages inform youth decisions as well. And so from this work on making disclosure decisions, I've come up with these sort of take-home messages for clinicians and people working with youth to think about. So the idea of readiness, expectation, and preparedness. So am I ready to disclose? This comes into their own coming out process and what they want. How will the relationship change? So one of the things that my research contributes is really looking at this at the family relational level. Youth were thinking about how their mom would react, but also how their mom would feel about having a gay child, or how their mom would feel needing to tell other people about having a gay child. So they're thinking in these relational ways that wasn't very well represented in the literature previously. And then, can I handle whatever happens? Obviously, makes a lot of sense. So these are very consistent with the other literature in terms of rewards and costs from disclosure, but I want to point out a couple of the costs that I think are really applicable for families. So avoidance or denial is the idea of a don't ask, don't tell. So I came out and then we just didn't talk about it. That this was perceived as negative. When a youth discloses, they want the family to care, and if you avoid it and deny it, that sends a negative message. And then the ignorant or nosy questions. If you ask, is this a phase? Did someone touch you inappropriately? Why are you coming out now? Some youth weren't ready for these kinds of questions, and so this really impacted them as well. Okay, last slide. The other part of my research is really looking at this ongoing relationship, and that when a child discloses, this is not a bad thing, but it does change the nature of relationships. And change, again, is not a bad thing. It's just a change. And so these transitions are really important for the families and their experiences. And so this is a quote from one of the youth: "I don't want them to see me as a lesbian, I just want them to see me." So obviously, they just want to be seen as the person they are, but the fact that they did disclose did impact that relationship. And then for a parent, if people weren't going to accept him, then they weren't going to be in my life. And so this gets into the kinds of decisions parents may face when a youth discloses and how they're going to address that. So here, my last slide is just some references that sort of gets at some of this research. Thank you. Yeah, when Jen was talking about her work with trans kids and she mentioned the access to resources, this is definitely something that's really important for sexual minority youth as well in rural spaces. Just access to community, access to information, not feeling like you're the only one in your school, which is a thing that we typically hear, right? Like, I was the only gay person in my school, so of course I wasn't going to join the GSA or the organization. So things like that, I think access is a big thing. The other thing is, when we think about the research and we think of things that help and hurt LGBTQ youth, the magnitude of those things, availability of those things may be different if you're in a rural space versus an urban space, just because you have the lack of resources, but also isolation and the kinds of things that might help you get out of that, like connection to a community center or connection to community, which we know is important. Some kids don't have that as much, even though we do have the internet now, so. I guess the only thing I would add is picking up on what Ramona first said about being involved in the community, and that's what, in my work in Blacksburg, which is a college town as well, but it's embedded in a very rural context of Southwest Virginia. So there very much is this divide, like, okay, oh, you're in Blacksburg or are you out of Blacksburg? Because if you're outside the city limits, that is, very different or much more conservative than than people think of Blacksburg. And it's not that you have to be an activist, but you need to be involved and active in the community. You need to be present, you need to be an ally, and that these things send messages that you are safe and not just looking to study them. A young man that I work with just got a tattoo of the chemical symbol for testosterone with the dates that he started taking it. So it's just an example of how valuable it is, meaningful. working on one that was in collaboration with the diversity educators in Virginia. The challenge that, and I wanted it to be a fact sheet, so like a one or a front and back sort of sided thing. It seems like one of the challenges is very difficult to get everything you need to know on one sheet, and also that, and also like what the educators want or like what they think will be helpful, I think it so depends on your community context. So I know for me, I was really relying on what do you guys see as wanting to be on this. So I think it's important for anybody working with extension and you know, stuff that's going out in the field to find out what the community wants versus you know, asking or having one of us do it or for us to do it without talking to your communities, because that, I know that's something that as in process was a challenge, because somebody doesn't want a fact sheet on disclosure decision making. You know, they want a fact sheet on why do I care about LGBT stuff in general. One more hot topic that has come up locally for us was for camping. So we've had a lot of questions from extension educators on like, how do I respond if we have a trans youth that wants to come to camp? What cabin do I put them? Very like practical things. And then what, when I talk to a parent that might be angry about this, what can I rely on or what support can I give that parent? So that's just a practical thing that's come up in our extension community. I asked that question as a test or as a test question in my undergraduate class. Like, are there only two genders, or are there more than two genders or something? And I still have people in my class that say no, or there's only two or whatever because of their values. And that's fine, but I would just say, and particularly talking to children, that, well, there actually are people that identify as something other than male or female. Like, it's just, you know, there are, we know that. One of the things that I'm doing is, after finally getting some of these papers published, to actually be able to translate some of the materials into handouts, things that agencies can use, clinicians can use, helping professionals in different that work in different capacities can use. So now that it's published, I can finally start to do some of that work. And then in terms of like for communities and agencies in particular, is just what I hope to see is just more inclusive practices from the get-go, instead of it being like a family has to be affected negatively before it's moved you know, into an inclusive space, or before someone has to question it before you change a form to include, you know, more than one gender, or to not have like a heteronormative representation of that it's always a mom and a dad, those sorts of things, just more inclusivity.